May 23, 1701, London, execution dock at Wapping on the north bank of the Thames, and thousands of ordinary English citizens had gathered on the riverbank to watch a man be hanged in the grey morning light. The man being brought to the gallows was Captain William Kidd, a Scottish-born mariner who had once been one of the most respected privateer captains in the British world, given a royal commission to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean, financially backed by 4 of the most powerful Whig lords in Parliament, and trusted enough that the King of England himself had signed his papers. And here is the question that every serious historian who has studied this case eventually has to sit with. Was William Kidd actually a pirate at all? Or was he a man who followed difficult orders under impossible circumstances at sea, and was then quietly sacrificed by the same aristocratic sponsors who had sent him out there in the first place, because keeping him alive had become politically inconvenient? The rope snapped on the first drop. They hung him a second time. His body was afterwards sealed in an iron gibbet cage and suspended over the Thames for years as a rotting warning to every sailor who passed. And somewhere before that happened, he had left behind something that would drive people to obsession for 300 years. This story begins around 1645 in Greenock, Scotland, where William Kidd was born the son of a Presbyterian minister, which meant a childhood shaped by discipline, hard work, and the moral seriousness of Calvinist faith, none of which would ultimately protect him from what was coming. By 1695, he had achieved what most men of his origins could only imagine: a fine house in New York on Pearl Street, a wealthy wife named Sarah Bradley Cox Oort, a personal fortune of real significance, and the serious attention of powerful men in London who were about to hand him both the opportunity of his lifetime and the rope that would end it. The men who came to William Kidd in 1695 with a proposition were not minor figures. They were Richard Coote, the Earl of Bellamont, newly appointed governor of New York and Massachusetts, and behind him stood 4 of the most powerful Whig lords in England: the Duke of Shrewsbury, the Earl of Romney, the Earl of Orford, and Lord Chancellor Somers, men whose combined influence could shape government policy and make or destroy careers across the empire. Their proposal was straightforward in concept. They would fund the fitting out of a ship. Kidd would command it under a privateering commission, authorizing him to attack pirates and enemy French vessels in the Indian Ocean, and profits from captured prizes would be divided according to an agreed formula, with the noble sponsors taking the lion's share. What this arrangement failed to make clear, and what Kidd possibly did not fully understand when he signed, was that the investors had structured everything so that if the voyage succeeded, they profited enormously. And if it failed or became politically embarrassing, William Kidd would stand completely and entirely alone to face whatever consequences followed. The ship Kidd received for this mission was the Adventure Galley, a 287-ton vessel specifically designed to function as both a sailing ship and a galley. It could be rowed by oars when the wind died, useful in the Indian Ocean but requiring a large crew, which immediately created a financial pressure that would haunt every decision made afterward. The Adventure Galley left London in 1696 with about 70 men, sailed to New York to take on additional sailors, and departed for the Indian Ocean with roughly 150 men aboard. And here is where the first serious problem emerged, because the quality of that crew was, by any reasonable assessment, deeply problematic. By 1697, the voyage had turned into something far removed from what had been planned in London drawing rooms, and the pressure inside the Adventure Galley had become genuinely dangerous. The ship had developed serious leaks and was in poor structural condition. The crew had not been paid because no prizes had been taken, and many of the survivors were openly mutinous, arguing that they had signed on to make money and that hunting pirates under a legal commission was not producing any results. Kidd found himself trapped between legal obligations on one side and the demands of a desperate crew on the other, with the very real awareness that without capturing some kind of prize, soon he would lose control of the ship entirely. Was there any good decision available to him at that point? It is lie in this context that what happened next can be properly understood, not as the act of a man who chose to become a criminal, but as a series of judgments made under conditions of extreme pressure, deteriorating resources, and steadily collapsing authority. On October 30th, 1697, on the deck of the Adventure Galley, William Kidd killed a man named William Moore. Moore was the ship's gunner and had been agitating openly among the crew, calling Kidd a coward and demanding they attack a Dutch vessel they had encountered, which would have been piracy, since England and the Netherlands were not at war, and Kidd had refused. The argument escalated. Kidd picked up an iron-bound wooden bucket and struck Moore in the head, and Moore died of his injuries the following day. This single act, committed in anger on a ship far from any legal authority by a commander under extreme professional strain, would later be presented at trial as evidence of murderous character, stripped of every piece of context that might have helped a jury understand what was actually happening aboard that vessel. The more consequential turning point came in January 1698, when the Adventure Galley stopped a large Armenian-owned merchant vessel called the Quedagh Merchant, which was sailing under a French pass, documentation that, under the terms of Kidd's privateering commission, technically authorized him to seize it as an enemy prize. The Quedagh Merchant was carrying cargo valued at somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 rupees, a fortune by any standard of the era, comprising textiles, gold, silver, and trade goods representing one of the largest single prizes any privateer had captured in those waters. And Kidd took it, believing this was entirely within his legal authority because of the French pass the ship carried. What Kidd may not have fully grasped, anchored in the Indian Ocean with his crew celebrating around him, was that this cargo belonged in large part to powerful Indian merchants and to officials connected to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, and that seizing this ship was about to trigger a diplomatic crisis threatening to destroy the East India Company's entire trading relationship with the Mughal Empire, one of the most commercially important relationships in the world, responsible for the flow of goods that made English merchants extraordinarily wealthy. When word of the Quedagh merchant seizure reached London and the East India Company began receiving furious communications from Mughal officials threatening to expel English traders from Indian ports entirely, the political calculation for Kidd's noble sponsors changed immediately and completely. These were men of great power but also of consuming self-interest, and the self-interest now pointed in one direction only. William Kidd had to be disavowed, prosecuted, and if possible convicted, because the alternative was that their own involvement in this venture would come under scrutiny, and four of the most powerful lords in England could not afford that kind of scrutiny during a period of intense partisan warfare between the Whigs and the Tories. Kidd, still at sea and entirely unaware that his patrons had abandoned him, sailed the captured ship, which he had renamed the Adventure Prize, toward the Caribbean, eventually abandoned the leaking hulk in a harbor in Hispaniola, transferred the most portable valuables to a smaller sloop, and sailed north toward the American colonies, apparently still believing that Lord Bellamont would honor their agreement and stand by him. In the summer of 1699, as Kidd sailed toward New England, he made a series of stops along the eastern seaboard, and at one of those stops, on Gardiner's Island, off the eastern tip of Long Island, he buried a substantial quantity of treasure that by various accounts included gold, silver, jewels, and goods from the Quedagh Merchant, and this burial is the documented, historically verified origin of every Captain Kidd treasure legend that followed in the 3 centuries since. The value of what was buried at Gardiner's Island has been estimated at between 10,000 and 14,000 British pounds sterling, an extraordinary sum in 1699, equivalent to several $1 million in modern terms, and most of it was recovered almost immediately, because when Kidd was arrested in Boston in July 1699 by Lord Bellamont, who had betrayed him completely, agents were sent to Gardiner's Island within days, dug up the buried goods, and shipped them to London as evidence for the trial. But the persistent and unshakable belief, the one that has sent thousands of people digging on islands from the Caribbean to the coast of Maine, is that this was not everything, that Kidd buried more somewhere else, and that he left some kind of record of where. The map. This is the element of the Captain Kidd story that has generated more obsession, more fraud, more elaborate theories, and more wasted expeditions than perhaps any other document in maritime history. And what was the fundamental problem? No authenticated Captain Kidd treasure map has ever been conclusively proven to exist. What does exist are several documents and ciphers that appeared in the years after his execution. Some attributed to Kidd himself, some claim to have been found in old sea chests or tucked inside the spines of antique books, and essentially all of them have, upon examination by experts in historical documents and cryptography, turned out to be either outright forgeries, hoaxes crafted by men who understood the Kidd legend was powerful enough to make people abandon critical thinking, or so genuinely ambiguous that no one has ever decoded them into actionable directions to anywhere. Oak Island, off the coast of Nova Scotia, has been the site of one of the longest and most expensive treasure hunts in recorded history, and the connection to Captain Kidd is one of the theories used to explain why someone supposedly buried something in an elaborate underground pit on that island in the late 17th or early 18th century. The so-called Money Pit was reportedly discovered in 1795 by a teenager named Daniel McGuinness, who noticed a circular depression in the ground beneath an oak tree and began digging, eventually encountering layers of logs placed at precise 10-foot intervals, suggesting deliberate human construction. And from that point forward, the site attracted investors and engineering expeditions that collectively spent millions of dollars and lost at least 6 lives in flooding accidents, digging deeper and finding logs, coconut fiber, stone slabs with inscriptions, and flooded chambers, but never finding any treasure that could be attributed to Captain Kidd or to any other known historical figure, because the connection rests entirely on geographic proximity and legend, rather than on a single piece of documentary evidence linking Kidd to that island. The deeper truth about William Kidd's treasure, and the reason the legend has proven impossible to kill, is that the known facts of the case actually do support the conclusion that not everything he carried was recovered by Bellomont's agents in 1699, and Kidd himself, in letters written from Newgate Prison while awaiting trial, made explicit references to valuables he could reveal if the government would negotiate with him. Was the government willing to negotiate? Not at all. Doing so would have required acknowledging the political complexity of the case, the involvement of the noble lords, and the distinct possibility that Kidd's actions had far more legal justification than the prosecution was prepared to concede. Kidd apparently offered, at various points, to lead authorities to additional buried goods in exchange for his life, or at minimum, a fair hearing. And those offers were refused or simply ignored, which means that if additional treasure existed and its location died with him at Execution Dock in 1701, then the English government itself made the deliberate choice to let that knowledge disappear rather than face the political consequences of hearing what William Kidd actually had to say. In the 3 centuries since his execution, at least 17 expeditions have been mounted specifically in search of Kidd's buried fortune, spanning locations from the Caribbean to the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal to remote coastlines off Madagascar, and the total money spent across all of them almost certainly exceeds the value of any treasure that was actually buried, which is, when considered carefully, a fairly complete illustration of what a sufficiently powerful legend can do to otherwise rational people. The man was hanged twice, gibbeted over the Thames for years, and denied the chance to speak freely about what he actually knew. And what he knew, if the prison letters mean anything at all, went with him.